Hello, everybody. This is Amy Dessenberg-Wines, and I am delighted to welcome you to today's community of practice. Um, I am with the Iowa Coalition for Integration and Employment and a member of Iowa's Employment First team, and I want to thank you so much for joining us today. I want to also thank both Iowa Vocational Rehabilitation Services and the Iowa Developmental Disabilities Council for their continued leadership and investment in the Iowa Community of Practice, which is a collaborative effort with the Iowa Coalition for Integration and Employment and has been since 2014. I'll be your host or moderator for today's webinar, as well as Gayla Harkin, who is here to assist. And I am delighted to have Derek Willis with the University of Iowa's USED, who's going to be presenting on engaging diverse populations and cultural responsiveness. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be posted to the Iowa Coalition for Integration and Employment's YouTube channel, as well as to IVRS's Employment First page. And the recording link will be shared following the webinar along with the presentation. If you haven't already, please subscribe to ICE's YouTube channel. Closed captioning is available. It's the stream text link has been sent in our invitation email, and it's also in the chat box for your reference. In order to ensure that everyone can clearly hear the presenters today and hopefully avoid any technical difficulties, we've muted everyone and disabled cameras. So please be sure to share your questions and comments in the chat feature of Zoom, and we will help field those and share those with Derek. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll go ahead and get started. I'm going to turn it over to you, Derek. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. Can you hear me okay, Amy?
Yes.
Okay,
Good,
thank you.
good audio. Can other folks hear Derek well?
Very good. I first want to thank Amy for and Gayla and also IC for just really kind of putting this topic in the forefront. And Amy and I have been talking about this for some time, and it always comes up, and she has never forgot this topic and always would ask when I am available to do this. And so I'm grateful for you, Amy, and grateful for you seeing this area of focus as an area of importance and continuing to be persistent in terms of me scheduling some time to be available to address and have a conversation related to engaging diverse populations in some cultural responsive practices. This is an area that I began working in 2002. I was assigned the director of an Office of Multicultural Affairs for the state of Missouri's Department of Mental Health, and really was baptized by just the work. And I think when I think about this work, I think about it as it is the science has not caught up to the practice. And so there's a tremendous opportunity for research to be done in this area to help build capacity in this area. And sometime in my career, if it ever slows down, I would really like to work with specific agencies to really kind of look at practices that really move this topic forward. And so anytime I get the opportunity to talk about diverse populations and engagement in culturally responsive systems, I'm delighted. And so again, as you said, Director for the state of Iowa, I don't have a lot of time and effort to address this issue, but it is something that is near and dear to my heart, and it's something that I want to advance in any kind of way that I can, and I will do what I can to make time to be responsive to you and your needs as it relates to this area. Amy and Gayla and I had a wonderful conversation before this presentation to really kind of think about how can we take it to the next level. As you know, in this area, it is so complex that it's very difficult for you to have one session or one training opportunity and then you walk away saying, hey, I'm culturally competent. Number one, and you'll see in my lessons learned, I don't believe that there's a thing called cultural competency. I think it's an ongoing process that continues, that you have to continue to invest time and resources in to get to that level where you begin to understand. And so, so one session, and I'm not saying that this session, I'm hoping that you'll pick some things from here and walk away from here to say, this is a place where I can start. These are some things that I hope are thought provocative to you, that where you say, you know, maybe this is an area that we need to investigate and work more within my organization, within me as a practitioner. And so just know that the things that I've put together today are really to kind of help you move forward in this topic. And I don't proclaim this to be a one-time shot, that once you finish or once we have this discussion today, that you're ready to move forward. I hope that I do stimulate you to begin to think deeper about some of the things that you can do in order to be more culturally responsive. So I'll say that right off the top. So today, basically what I've done is really put together a presentation that will start with a rationale. Why is this important? And I targeted a specific population, but I want to say in the beginning that this is not about ethnicity only. It's not about race only. It's also about LGBT. It's also about specific communities that might be in your service areas, like an Amish community. And so we, a lot of times we tend to look at race and ethnicity when we have this conversation about cultural and responsiveness, but it's also around understanding who are the people that are in your service areas that you're not reaching, and how do you begin to address that? Whether it's a young audience that's a hip hop culture that you say, hey, maybe we don't know anything about that. Whether it is an immigrant population that has moved into your community. I know in the city of Iowa City, there's a Congolese population, there's a Sudanese population. But it's not always about ethnicity, and I do want to point that out as well. So, so today also I'm going to highlight, even though I said that it's not about ethnicity, I am going to highlight and use an example African American community within Iowa, the African American population within Iowa, and so that's the culture that, and that's the ethnicity that I identify with, and so I just wanted to bring out some points only to make the rationale to say why this is important, and emphasize some of the things that has taken place within that population, the small population in Iowa, that has a tremendous impact on outcomes. And so I want to start with highlighting the African American in Iowa population, and then I want to move to some of work related to what I talk about, you know, more of lessons learned, the things that I've learned through my over 20 years of doing this work. Plus, I will also talk about within an organization and as practitioners, what are some of the things that we can do. I call those indicators of high performance in these particular areas. And so if these things are present, the likelihood of your ability to work with diverse populations, to do and to be responsive to the needs of people from different backgrounds, I think increases. And so I'll go through that. So that's how I have it structured, just the rationale, I want to give you some information in terms of some of my lessons learned, best practices, and then also talk a little bit about some indicators that will lead you to some high performance. And then hopefully have enough time at the end to really kind of address some questions. We had a conversation, should we stop doing the presentation, but I think it's so, we don't have a lot of time, and so I like to get through the content, and then if you have questions, put them in the chat box, and then we will go back through those and answer and be responsive to some of those questions. So again, the rationale, why is this important? There's a number of reasons, and I just picked out a few things. The biggest thing is that our world is changing, and even though you might not be seeing it in your particular community, I have worked in, when I was doing the work in the state of Missouri, there were small towns that one thing would happen in that particular town or community where like a meat packing company like Tyson's would come in, and then they would see these tremendous demographic shifts and changes. And so people would say, well, we don't have to worry about this because it's not in my community, it's not in my neighborhood. I'm telling you, when I started this work, I saw these charts that said by 2050, this is going to be happening. And I didn't really believe it myself, but this is an example of the move that we've, and the shifts and the demographic changes that has happened in just this country alone. From this chart speaks to from 1980 all the way to 2050. And so when I began this work in the early 2000s, you know, you can see that the populations in terms of the dominant culture was 75%, and you know, we were seeing some demographic trends with the Latino population increasing, but if you go over to 2020, you see that now Latino populations are in somewhere between the area of 17 to 25%. You know, and this is all based on just who's reporting. And so I believe that these numbers are extremely higher than what we are seeing here. This data comes from the census, and we know not everybody participates in the census, and so, but it does give you an idea of the types of trends. And yes, the Latino population is the fastest growing ethnic group in this country, but you also see an Asian population increase. You also see the mixed race number increase, which I think that number is even higher. But the bottom line is to tell you that as time goes by, our culture, our communities will be changing because of these demographic shifts. Just advance to the next slide. As it relates to employment, and as you can see, there's always been this historical trend in which employment impacts people of color in a different kind of way. And so as you can see from this graph, it really shows that for a person who is African, Black, African American, or Black, identifies as that even in and you can see it almost incrementally, that theirs is historically, their rates of unemployment have historically been higher. And as you see all of the demographic changes and shifts there, they have been significantly higher. And in the Latino population, theirs is just slightly less than the Black. And then you can see what we call white in this graph. There's some consistency there as well. So the rationale that I see within this is that the color of your skin impacts outcomes that you have, and particularly related to employment in this conversation that we're having today. So think about that. Just, this is not including people with disabilities, and so we know that those rates are higher. I have one of my professors, one of my colleagues at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, called it the double jeopardy. that if you have a disability plus you're a person of color, it's a double jeopardy against you. And the trends that other people see, it impacts those communities more. Just wanted to give you some examples of some of the things that are happening to African Americans in the state of Iowa. So number one, the median age is low compared to others. And so what that tells us is that as time goes by, and you'll see among the preschoolers, the populations, even though African Americans in the state of Iowa is only 2.9 or 3%, let's go with 3%. When you start looking at the concentrations in preschoolers or young kids, their population is threefold. And so what's that telling me is that as time goes by, the numbers that we're seeing in the population now are going to increase because of the fact that they're reproducing at a higher rate. And so I did identify the major cities and the major areas where African Americans live. You'll see that there are other pockets across the state as well that has a significant, what we would consider a significant population of African American. Median income, this speaks to what I call the social determinants, looking at things like education and the ability. I don't have the data that talks about the dropout rates for this population, but I'm sure that the level of education impacts the income in some way. Knowing that if there's higher rates of dropouts among minorities, African American particularly here, we do know that the number of individuals from this population that enroll in college on the female side, somewhere around 10 to 12%, on the male side, somewhere around 4%. And all of those things impact your median income and your ability to make money to be in that position where you can provide and have resources as well. The next slide. And then if you start thinking about the things again, the poverty rate, all that is related to your ability to finish school, to attain employment, which we saw employment, it tends to be higher, unemployment tends to be higher among this population. And so all of those things influence if you're not advancing into a trade or into an educational environment that gives you the ability to gain knowledge in a particular area and be considered a specialist in an area, it impacts your overall quality. This one was intriguing to me where, although we only represented 3.7% of the state's population, if you look at the prison population, it's almost 25%. So almost a fourth of the individuals in that environment are from the African American community within this state. And so, and that's consistent across the country. When you look at prison population, you always see a minority population, particularly African American and Latino population, percentages being significantly higher than the state percentages. And so to me, when I see these types of things, it becomes some of those social determinants that when people don't have access to resources, when people don't have the ability to have quality employment, they're going to figure out a way to survive. And oftentimes it interfaces with law enforcement. Those communities that they live in, the high poverty communities, high crime communities, those communities are policed more frequently. And so if you're living in those communities, your opportunity to have engagement with law enforcement is probably going to be increased. And so again, all of these things are pointing to the rationale as to why I think that we need to begin to focus on how do we make sure that the resources that we have, how do we engage, how do we make sure that we can assist in these particular areas that impact our communities, particularly communities of color, in negative ways and stuff. So we can go to the next slide. The one thing that I always caution people when we start having this conversation around diversity and ethnicity is that you don't look at an individual the same just because they present in a way. I'll give you an example that will speak to this slide. I live in Iowa City, and within Iowa City, for the African community, and I call it African American because we're here, there's 5 sets of Africans. If you looked at a person, you would say, well, you would put them in a category of African American, but there's individuals that are from Congolese, there are individuals from Sudanese, there are individuals like myself who come to Iowa City through employment, mostly the university. They're Iowa City residents who were born and raised in Iowa City that are African American. And then there's this influx of individuals from Chicago, African Americans that have come to Iowa City from Chicago. So right there, within one ethnic group, you have 5 differences that all very few actually interchange or interconnect with each other. And so just by you're looking at an individual, you have to dig deeper in order to understand that there are differences within groups of people. And so and these are things that I think make it so complex when you start beginning to think about how do you be responsive. But I think these are the questions that you have to ask and begin to start thinking about. So an individual's migration experience makes them present different. Geographical location. I was born and raised in the South, and the way African Americans act and behave is totally different than an African American that was born and raised in the North. And so just our geographical locations, the cities versus the rural versus urban impacts the way a person would present. With the immigration status, the length of time in the United States, it's always important to know because sometimes there's this level of assimilation and acculturation, and so the length of time impacts the way that individuals present as well. Of course, we talked about socioeconomic status, educational levels, family intactness. It really kind of addresses the sense that I know people in families that I work with who never left the area in which they were born, and generation after generation, nobody ever left that area. And so those are strong family bonds that you have to take in consideration when you're dealing with an individual within that family. And so there's differences within groups, even when you see a person and you think that, okay, they identify as African American, there's something that is a little bit deeper that you still begin to have to peel underneath and begin to look at to see who they really are. And so I guess the only thing that I want to take away from this slide is that your eyes, just because you see somebody and you think that they are of a certain group, there is difference within that group as well. Next slide. And then just speak to a little bit of like what's happening right now with, particularly with immigration and looking at levels of acculturation. And so you will find that now I think that people who migrate to the United States are not as readily adapting to the American culture. And so there's people who come here, and that's where you see people who don't speak English, but live in the United States. And you say, if you live in this country, you should adapt to these things, but people are not doing that anymore. And so people are holding on to their traditional orientation, culture, their values, their norms, their language. And you'll see that more as time goes by, because people can be bicultural. They can live in American mainstream, but also hold on to their beliefs and hold on to their orientation of nature. Then you also have some that, you know, are more oriented towards the traditional culture and the mainstream, and those are the individuals that almost have forgot about where they came from and have totally embraced the main culture, and those individuals are the individuals that you'll see that are even put aside by their own culture. And so you'll see those who have transitioned to where they've adopted the main culture and don't even identify as their own culture. And then there's people who are bicultural, who comfortably can interchange. I see myself in that a lot. When I'm in a professional environment, sometimes when I'm around my friends, it's a difference, the way we communicate, the language, the way we greet. And so often as an African American, I find myself being bicultural, to where there's a mainstream that I know that I have to do in a professional environment in a way that I respond to individuals. But then also when I go to the community in which I was born and raised, there's not a lot of people who have gone to the level that I have professionally, and so they still see me as that person that lived there. And so I can't go there with the language that I do and I do every day in my business. And so it's like it's a bicultural situation. And so just understanding that even though people are here, even though people are presenting in a certain way, that there is levels of acculturation that they and it's helpful to understand that as you work with individuals from diverse backgrounds. You can go to the next slide, please. So what I want to do is introduce just the concept of upstreaming, and this was actually coined through public health, actually, where they started focusing on social determinants of health. And so, and this is a video that I'm not going to show the video, but if I did, it would be like, so people are traditionally downstream. We're taking what people present to us, and then we're trying to understand it in a way that, so how can we be helpful? But most of the time, if we're not thinking upstream to say, how can we prevent these things from happening? And that's really the language around social determinants of health. It's a lot of body of work to say, okay, how do we create better outcomes by looking at social determinants? How do we create better outcomes for individuals with disabilities who've come from backgrounds in employment, when we always only look at it from what is being presented? We know that they're not accessing services. We know we're not doing well at engaging them. So what are the things that we can do upstream? What are some things that we can do to help us engage and react and respond to some of the needs? And so the upstream thinking is about thinking before individuals start coming down the stream, before individuals start flooding our healthcare systems, before individuals, we can pluck one out, we can pluck two out, but then all of a sudden, if we're not thinking upstream, is so many people that are coming down that stream, we're not going to be able to save everybody. And so how do we begin to start changing our thoughts related to this, and how do we begin to start thinking about what are the things that we can do early on to begin to help address these particular issues? And so the upstream thinking. Next slide, please. So as I start this journey, again, I said in 2002, this is what I wanted to share with you today, just some of the lessons that I've learned as I began this journey of really trying to advance the practice of responsiveness, advance the practice of of culture and looking at diversity and really trying to develop an inclusive um, equity within these structures, and to create an environment that allows everybody to have equal access. And so here's some of the lessons learned. Number one, the first thing that most people want to do, and the first thing that I did when I got into this work, was to really try to say, how do you create opportunities for people from diverse backgrounds? And so diversifying your workforce, hiring an individual from the ethnic group that you're trying to engage in, making sure that you have diversity among your staff. It is important, and I don't want to belittle this, but I also want to caution you that just because you diversify your staff, it doesn't always bring competencies. One of the we had an organization in the state of Missouri that dealt with primarily African Americans patients, and they also had a primarily African American staff. And when we did satisfaction from the clients to find out if that the quality of service was there, the ones who were least satisfied were the ones who came from the organizations that had high levels of diversity and had high levels of diverse populations receiving the service. And so I learned early on that just because you have a diverse workforce doesn't necessarily bring the cultural competence. And so that is an important step to take, but it doesn't bring the competence. Also, translating documents. We put a lot of effort into translating documents, saying that, okay, we have an influx of Latino populations. How do we translate the documents? What we learned was that a lot of people that that came and were presenting in the communities that we were trying to reach, they wasn't fluent in their own language, and so we didn't know that was an issue, and so understanding and doing assessments to find out who are you actually serving and what are those individual needs and what are the dynamics within those groups is important, because you can translate documents and then learn that people don't even read in their own language. And so understanding that translating documents is not the only answer. It is a key. It is something that we should be doing, but it's not the only answer. I believe that if you're going to begin to address this issue, it's always best to have a team and have co-leaders, because people change. You don't want this to be the work of one individual. When I took on this work at the Department of Mental Health for the state of Missouri, I had an Office of Multicultural Affairs. I was the leader in that. But when I left, that work stopped. And so learning from that perspective is, how do you create teams of individuals that can work on this area and address these issues, and how does it not become just one person who's working in this area? The other thing, and I mentioned that earlier, is that I don't believe we're ever competent in culture. It's something that is dynamic. It's something that is fluid. It's something that requires ongoing attention, and you can learn in every situation. I think we can become aware, and we can become and try to always be in a situation where we're being responsive, but we're never competent in culture. It's constantly changing. Next slide, please. The other thing that I think a lot of people fail to do, and a lot of people have difficulty understanding, is how do they know when they have arrived? And I say that to say that this is a journey, and a lot of times you don't arrive, you don't get it all in one time. And so it's important to look at the small changes that you make and to celebrate those changes and to value those, because at every change that you make, you're constantly building on another step, another level of bringing you towards being this culturally responsive place and center and practice. And so celebrate those small things. If you put together a committee that is diverse in nature and you have engagement opportunities that you believe are successful, celebrate that, and know that it's just these small changes that really lead to the bigger changes as well. Being flexible and adaptable, because just because you start one way, you'll learn things as you go along. And so how do you modify that? How do you adapt that? We're going through that as an organization now, where we set a plan, but we also know that that plan needs to be responsive to what's happening at this day, not when we wrote it. And so always having that ability to be adaptable, be flexible, and having that mindset that it will change, you will have to change. And then being intentional. A lot of people say that they want these particular things to happen within their organization, but then they're not intentional about it. And so being intentional in terms of if you want to hire individuals from diverse backgrounds, how do you go about doing that? How do you specifically target that? If you want to reach a particular population, how do you be intentional about it? How do you begin to target that population? And then always, again, keeping sustainability in mind as you move forward. And then just a couple of things just from a leadership perspective. I think, a lot of people feel like they don't have the ability or they don't have the knowledge. I say start with where you are. I got this saying from when I was playing on a basketball team, and we had a game in Western Kansas, and as before every game, we'd always have a team meal, and we'd stop in these restaurants, and I remember this one particular restaurant that we stopped at, and I'm a Southern person, and so I like my tea sweet, and so I kept asking the waitress could I have some more sugar for my tea, and every time I asked her, she would tell me, stir what you got, stir what you got. And I was like, stir what you got. But to me, the way I take this is that just because you don't feel like you might have what is necessary to lead in this area, you do have something. And so take what you have, continue to build on what you have, and continue to grow, and stir what you got until you get where you want to be at. Getting comfortable, being uncomfortable, it is so important. And because there are going to be times when you're having discussions, there's going to be times where you are engaging and having conversations that sometimes are uncomfortable. We did a session on white privilege within our USED, and there were some people who felt like what was being said was uncomfortable, but it's okay to be in that state of ambiguity and to begin to learn how to work through those situations. One of my favorite leadership guys, Stephen Covey, talks about sharpening your tools. He looks at two individuals who are cutting wood and are constantly, one is constantly working and one is taking time to sharpen his tool, and he asks, which one do you think cut down the most wood? The one who never took a break, or the one who took a break to sharpen his tools? And it was always the one who took the break and sharpened the tools. And so taking time to gain knowledge, to better understand things, and sharpening your tools so that you can do this work is extremely important. And then bleed a little. Whenever you're on the cutting edge, a good friend of mine said, you're gonna bleed. And so don't be afraid to bleed a little as well when you're doing this work. Next slide, please. And then listen, because a lot of your answers, a lot of the things that will be helpful for you as you're moving in this direction require you to engage, and require you to have conversations, require you to listen before you act. And so listening twice as much as you act is important as well. And then knowing what's at the end in mind, knowing where you want to go, having a blueprint, having a sense of direction in terms of how do we know when we've arrived? And so keeping that end in mind and having a sense of that direction. It will change, but just having some understanding about it is important as well. And then knowing when not to lead. You know, I don't profess to know everything in this particular area, but also allowing a space and an environment for other people to lead as well, and particularly the people that you're trying to reach as well. So creating an opportunity for them to be at the table, but also not just be at the table, but also to lead as well. All right, so there's two things that I think that are important as we begin this work as well, and that is just looking at equity. And I think that we really have to define, and I challenge you in your positions, I challenge you in your organizations to define what does equity mean to you? Because equity is the key. Equity and inclusion, when I think about this work, there's three things: diversity, equity, and inclusion. And you'll see that those three that are used a lot in terms of organization and development, because we've moved beyond just equality. In that next slide, I can speak to it a little bit better, to where if you give everybody the same thing, that still doesn't mean that they have what they need in order to be effective. And so what we have to do is look at each situation individually and create in a spirit of equity, to where some people might need a little bit more, but all of us don't start at the same place. And so being equal can, it doesn't get us to where we want to be at. Next slide, please. And then inclusion. I think that this is something that we really have to continue to try to spend a significant amount of time on, and understanding what is inclusion, and understanding how does that impact your organization, understanding what does that mean within your organization, but ensuring that all individuals have the same opportunities, and really looking at it from that equity lens in terms of inclusion as well. Next slide, please. And so these are some of the things that I'm gonna run through these pretty quickly, because I see that we don't have a lot of time, and I do want to respond to any questions that you guys have. And so these are the things that I think should be necessary. And again, I mentioned that from my work, I look at these as just indicators that I think, if they are present within an organization, that they allow you to begin to move in the direction that makes you culturally responsive. And so if you look at an organization and you see that they have done some work around the needs of the community, and so some community assessments, so really kind of having a better understanding of what people need. And so that requires engagement, that requires community conversations, that requires assessments. And so if you see an organization that has put some work into being responsive to the communities after the assessments, you see an organization that is moving in the right direction. Conducting ongoing quality improvement, so looking within your organization, looking at the activities within your organization, constantly revisiting those and seeing if they are being, that they're yielding the results that you want. Is important. And so when you have an organization that is set aside a time that really looks at what are we doing, and constantly looking at quality improvement opportunities, you'll see an organization that's moving in the right direction. Feedback from the staff, valuing your staff, number one, and then hopefully having some efforts in place that make sure that when you do have a diverse team of individuals, that all voices are heard. And so providing opportunities for feedback, seeking that buy-in from staff as well is important, particularly staff that come from diverse backgrounds, in collecting that feedback, and not only collecting the feedback, but also acting on that as well. And something that we kind of talked about a little bit more is just demonstrating progress, sharing milestones, being transparent as well, knowing that when you don't reach a milestone, expressing that and saying how can and what can we do differently to address this issue. This is the direction that we took. It didn't yield us the results that we wanted. We're being transparent about it. How can we move forward and identify another area? Organizations that reach out, hire diverse groups of people, including people with disabilities. We're talking about this from a culture perspective. I look at disability as a culture as well, and so always inclusion of individuals as well. So really looking at organizations that promote and support a culture of inclusion, including people with disabilities, and modeling inclusion at all levels. And so sometimes we only look at frontline positions, but how do you be inclusive at all levels, even when you're doing engagement with folks, how they're included in the overall culture of the organization. Utilizing the expertise of individuals. Like I said, each of them bring their own experiences, their own backgrounds. People with disabilities, family members, support staff can be a resource as well. And so how do you utilize that expertise of the people with the lived experience in helping you create an inclusive environment as well? So making sure that that's inclusive. Next one. Again, developing an infrastructure that helps guide the work, and that's the teams and the committees that I talked about earlier, making sure that the work is valued. How does it start from the top all the way to the bottom in leadership that embraces this? And then from your organizational perspective, looking at your principles, your guidelines, your mission, your focus, how is that written anywhere? Is it a part of your organizational goals? So making sure that as you're talking about this, that it's written in guidelines and principles. Looking for ways to retain, recruit, retain, train, volunteers, all of that. If you see that organizations are doing alternative methods and really trying to put this at a level that is of high priority, you will see organizations that are responding in a different kind of way. And next slide, please. The relationships, sometimes it's not only you and your organization that has the connection of the relationship with the people that you're wanting to engage with in the diverse population. Sometimes it's through community partnerships with community-based organizations. When I worked in Kansas City, there was an organization that had the credibility with the Latino community called Matty Rhodes. And so instead of me trying to go out and establish those relationships with that particular community, I went through the organization and so created partnerships with them. Identifying key leaders from those communities that you're wanting. I love the concept of a cultural broker. In the Latino community, they call it a promotora. How do you utilize those individuals that are living in the community, that come from that community, that have credibility in that community to help you promote the work that you're trying to do? And so any organization that recognizes those key leaders and develops partnerships with those key leaders is an organization that I feel is moving in that direction where they're being responsive. And always creating an opportunity within your organization to build capacity among your staff, and to creating these safe spaces and brave spaces for people that can have conversations and to move from being safe into those brave spaces where you're not afraid that you're offending anybody, where everybody is safe, but you really are pushing to where you're having the more provocative and thought-provoking conversations and stuff. And then looking at language as a plan How are you going to address those issues? How are you going to communicate with individuals that maybe don't speak English or maybe use a sign or something? And so if you see those things present in an organization, that's moving towards a culturally responsive structure and a system. So again, embedding the principles and guidance in any kind of like partnerships, relationships, embedding it into your performance expectations and measures when you're doing annual performances. Do you have questions in there that ask or related to cultural or engagement or outreach? An organization that is constantly reaching out and building relationships with different communities, diverse populations within their service areas. That's even if it's going to just a cultural event that they're celebrating Juneteenth for an African American situation, or just really trying to find out what are those cultural events that are taking place in your community and participating in those. And then always doing needs assessments, really trying to assess the demographic trends within your populations. As I said, in the communities that I was working in Missouri, it would take one company that might have a relationship with a group of folks that could change the dynamic of that community overnight. And so really looking at demographic trends, demographic changes, and being responsive to that. So I'm gonna stop right here, Amy, and then just, because this is really talking about practitioners, and we can pick up on this a little bit later, and then we'll share this PowerPoint with you all as well. But I want to take a break and give people an opportunity to ask questions and make sure that I'm being responsive to what some of the needs are, because we know that people come here sitting at different seats, and you have the ability to influence in different ways. And so the challenge with doing these presentations is how do you provide something that meets the needs of all people at where they sit at. And so I'm just want to stop here and really kind of give you guys an opportunity to kind of, if you have any questions based on some of the things that I've presented, to just to ask those now.
Yeah, Derek, this is Gayla, and we do have a question from Jan. She'd like to know, do you have a toolkit that you could share that has the list from the PowerPoint to measure an entity's cultural responsiveness? Do you have the tools that people could use?
Yeah, so I didn't put the resources on here that I didn't want to be too scholarly. so yes, I do have some places that you can go. One of my favorites is from Georgetown, their National Center for Cultural Competency. It's Georgetown University, and if you just Google Georgetown University, and then look up in their search, look up the National Center for Cultural Competency, they have a lot of tools that I like that can help people begin to assess and look at where they are within their organization and help them guide in the particular areas that they feel are important to move forward as well. You're welcome.
If other folks have particular questions or comments, please feel free to put them in the chat box, and we can get Derek to address them.
Mm. So the other thing that we're thinking about is if there are people who are on the call who want to dig deeper into this dialogue and into working within their agency, their individual agency, to begin to address some of these issues, I would be willing to And I think Amy is also, we'd be willing to kind of create a community of practice that maybe we can tackle some particular areas of focus that I know that in the cultural competency journey in this process that you will have to I at least based on my knowledge and my experience, that I would recommend that you would do some of these particular things. One is engagement and outreach. And so we can talk about how do you do that engagement? How do you do that outreach? How do you connect? If you're using cultural brokers, what are some best practices related to cultural brokers? You know, some people ask the question, do you pay them? Are they a staff? Do you give them stipends, or what is protocol related to cultural brokers? And so how can we advance some of these things that I think would be necessary as you as an organization are moving forward to begin to provide culturally responsive care? It's just not something that you can have one session and have one conversation on and walk away, you know, being successful in this area. It is a lot of practice. It is a lot of engaging and continuously having this dialogue and conversation related to it. So.
Thank you so much, Derek. One of the things that we thought would be great is if folks are interested, you can reach out to us, or you can put your name and your contact information in the chat box, and we can follow up, and we can also include this in our follow-up email to let people know that if they would like to continue discussions and maybe be part of a larger effort or community of practice, we really would love to continue to invest in moving forward in this area. And Derek, that was a fabulous presentation. I want to thank you so much, and we really appreciate your time. If you haven't jumped off yet, please take a look in the chat box. There's an evaluation link, and we'd really appreciate it if you wouldn't mind going to that link. It'll just take probably less than a minute to provide us with some feedback, and we'll share that with Derek as well in our evaluation. We'd also like to encourage you to join us for our next Community of Practice webinar in May, which is May 26th, and it will be 1 to 2. And the topic is Students, Transition, Collaboration, a Framework for Success, and I will be presenting that in May. So we're hoping you can join us for that, and please feel free to reach out if you have any questions. And again, I want to thank Derek so much for his time and all the valuable information, and hopefully we can continue on in this area and continue to learn. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Have a fabulous day.
Thank you.